The week after, the week before. Whilst the attempted coup by Russia's mercenary Wagner group was both ignited and extinguished within 24 hours, the aftermath is still being felt. With Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin fleeing to Belarus, the Kremlin has been telling its partners that they have absorbed the private military company ahead of the initial planned merger on July the 1st. Meanwhile, reports have circulated that Russian General Sergei Surovikin has been arrested for his role in the mutiny as the Kremlin is cracking down on the so-called traitors. But the damage seems to have been done, with Ukrainian officials saying the countdown is on until Vladimir Putin is deposed as Russian leader. Putin, meanwhile, has made a rare public appearance among the crowds in southern Russia as he tries to rally public support. But is it too late? Despite the domestic issues, Russia is continuing its assault on Ukraine, with 8 killed and over 50 injured in a recent strike in the eastern city of Kramatorsk. Will continuing this method work, or do the Russians need a tactical overhaul? Is there any way for Russia to win the war, or has Russia already lost the war?
So let's get to it, dear panelists. Has Russia already lost the war? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So, Katerina, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Yeah, sure. We cannot make any conclusions so far. We don't know whether Russia is losing the war.
I don't hear the broadcast.
Right now, we know that Ukraine is actually very active right now, and its counteroffensive is going on. What we understand right now is Putin is weaker than it was before, than Putin's army was before. So what we can see, the conclusions right now are that Russia is weaker than it was before this mutiny. Let's see what's happened. What will happen next?
Yeah, Michael, Tracey, your thoughts.
My thought is basically that while we should all maintain some humility in interpreting these complex events that are occurring in a country on the other side of the world in a native language that we don't speak, I think it's plausible, or at least should be proposed as worth entertaining, that Putin has actually consolidated power in the aftermath of this episode because he neutralized his chief challenger to his rule domestically, and Putin declared that he had maintained cohesion and support among the National Security Council at his disposal in the executive office, the legislative state power outfits. So if that's the case, and Putin has strengthened his hand, even if the initial incursion with the Wagner advancing forces clearly revealed some of the fundamental frailties and vulnerabilities of Russian state capacity.
Okay, and we are having some slight technical difficulties, and Yaki Dayan will soon be joining us, but let's feel free to interact from this point onwards to engage in a conversation. So let's begin with the point Michael Tracey just made. Is Putin weaker or stronger in the aftermath of this attempted coup? Katerina.
Well, I was saying that and I'm sure that he is definitely weaker. What we saw was a panic in Russia. I know, and we know, the sources of our colleagues, journalists, are telling us that there were people from the very top of Russia's system were leaving the country. We know that there were special planes. We can suggest that it was maybe Putin's planes that left Moscow and were back to Russia's capital only on Sunday, when Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator, has actually made a deal with Yevgeny Prigozhin. What we see right now, the moves that Vladimir Putin is making publicly, is that he's trying to, to appear in southern Russia, to be among people, which is very rare for him. He doesn't do that ever, actually. After COVID began, he was not seen, with people around him, with the random people around him. So what he's trying to do is to prove to everyone that he's stronger than ever. But I have so many doubts about that. And a lot of people in Russia have so many doubts about that after Rostov-on-Don, a big city, was actually occupied by a person who was created by Vladimir Putin's system.
And to that point exactly, Michael, Tracey, what do you make of the suggestion that Prigozhin and Putin were actually in some sort of cahoots, that it was all in a bid to portray Vladimir Putin as A, the strong man, and B, the lesser of two evils from the Western standpoint?
You know, this is all a matter of speculation, at least as far as I've seen. You know, journalistic conjecture, I found, especially in wartime, is not all that useful.
Yeah.
Which is why I think it's probably worth bearing in mind that, in general, the U.S. has declared that it is engaged in an unprecedented campaign of information warfare against Russia. This has been the case since late December of 2021. Ken Dayan, NBC News reporter, said in April 2022 that the U.S. is we have never seen this level of information warfare from the U.S. government. That's what Ken Dayan, the NBC News reporter, said. And it was because the U.S. was using the strategy of selectively weaponizing disclosure of classified information to counter what it perceived as Russia's narrative, including by planting false information into the media. That was admitted. I mean, this is not speculation on my part. Okay. Go look up the NBC News article. And I mention this because as we're following these minute-by-minute developments now vis-a-vis this armed rebellion situation and the potential purge going on now with different generals, you got to bear in mind that information warfare operators are very intentionally and openly leveraging this situation to continue waging their warfare campaign against Russia, which I have to acknowledge has been rather effective because Russia does seem somewhat weakened at this point. Well,
Cold War tactics are a classic for a reason, right? Classics work. Yaki, Dayan, please chime in. Is the threat to Putin merely shelved?
It is not. You know, Putin is weaker than ever. You can just imagine where he was 2 years or a year and a half ago, just before the invasion to Ukraine, and where he is now with the internal rebellion, isolated completely, economically much weaker. Europe is isolating Russia, both on the diplomatic level and the economic level. In the long run, they're becoming energy independent from Russia. So Russia is in such a weaker stand than before the invasion, before February 2022, the invasion to the Ukraine, that his position is definitely not secured and not strong at all.
So, can I pose a question on that?
Please, Michael. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you've heard it repeated widely throughout the media, or at least I've seen it and heard it, that Putin is just obviously and clearly as weak as he's ever been since he took power in 2000. Now, that may be true. I don't know. Difficult to say with any precision. But let's just consider whether Putin can be said to be more powerful than he was just 2 weeks ago. Forget years. 2 weeks ago, there was still a simmering internal factional dispute led by Prigozhin against Putin / the Ministry of Defense that hadn't been resolved. Now that factional dispute has been resolved, at least insofar as Prigozhin himself seemingly neutralized, Putin reasserting power and consolidating support among the key levers of the state apparatus. Yeah. So in that respect, you could easily say that Putin actually has fortified his power compared to 2 weeks ago. Like, look, I know people have a pro-Ukraine cause that they want to support. That's fine, but you also got to at least strive to analyze things like this a bit impartially.
The answer is very simple. I mean, for the short run, you're right. I mean, he has secured. Definitely 2 weeks ago, he was less secure than now. But for the long run, having Russia isolated internationally, much weaker economically, then he's not strong at all. And that's just a matter of time when another rebellion or somebody else will undermine his regime. So for the short run, yes, maybe he's safe, and Russia is safe, and Russia is not going to fall tomorrow. But for the long run, listen, their main source of income was the supply of energy to Europe. Europe has learned a lot learned the lesson a year ago, not to depend on Russia on the energy sources. So yes, they can still import or export, energy to India and to China, but this is much more expensive for much less price. So Europe is becoming more independent. Europe is becoming much stronger in terms of military. I mean, they're arming themselves heavily. Finland has joined NATO. Sweden is on the way to join NATO.
Sir, with all due respect, these are we've heard these talking points before. I thought we were discussing the armed rebellion or mutiny, as Putin called it, not this kind of long-term perspective.
Can I add something too, if you don't mind, because there is. A lot of things that we need to consider right now. First is that Russia is actually getting more income than it was before the invasion began, the full-scale invasion began. This is important to understand, right? That the price is okay for oil and gas for Russian Federation, and Vladimir Putin is fine with his economy. Unfortunately, this is the reality that we need to acknowledge, right? I mean, we should not talk about Russian Federation as a totally isolated state, because it is not. And unless it is in China's and India's interests, Russia will be a partner of this.
Could you imagine?
I just wanted to add one thing about rebellion, which is, I think, most important thing after those very striking days and hours that we've been following the situation with Prigozhin. I agree with you, actually, when you say that Putin is weaker, but he is weaker not because Prigozhin is detained or something like that, but because the whole country and also the Western world have seen that one person can, just like that, take a city, occupy a city of Russian Federation, a big city, and also that one person can lead to a situation when in Moscow, people with weapons were lying on the streets expecting some people, Wagner mercenaries, to invade the capital of Russia. This is something that we need to analyze, I think. This is something that no one was expecting. And this is the main outcome from all this mess with mutiny of Prigozhin.
Could I ask you, I mean, a year ago, could you imagine that Russia would still be meddling in Ukraine, losing so many battles? Could you imagine a year ago that Russia will turn to Iran to get drones to supply?
Of course, but we need to be more realistic. You're right, but we need to be more realistic.
Okay.
I mean, Russia is not in a disastrous position so far.
We do need to put a hold on our thoughts right here, because we have to take a quick break, but we'll obviously continue from that point exactly a few minutes, and we're back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Katerina, Kotrikadze, Michael Tracey, and Yaki Dayan. Thank you all so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, Russia is still fighting the enemy from within to an extent. Is also still fighting in Ukraine. So what's the view from Kyiv? Here's what Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had to say.
The underlying sources of death and ruin are so-called frozen conflicts. Any frozen conflict is a war that must eventually break out. The only question is when it will break out and how many lives it will take. That's why peace must be honest. And the Ukrainian peace formula provides such a peace, and that's why Ukraine's peace formula is universally applicable. Ukraine will not agree to any of the variants for a frozen conflict, not to anyone.
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. In the aftermath of this so-called foiled coup, mutiny, you name it, is the war in Ukraine closer to an end? Yaki Dayan, please take the lead.
Not at all. I mean, from the Russian point of view, Zelensky is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And from the Ukrainian side, Putin is part of the problem, not part of the solution. So unless one of them is gone, we'll see the fighting in Ukraine continuing.
Michael Tracey, your take.
Yeah, I think contrary to what one of the other guests suggested in the previous segment, it's not clear that it should be written off that Russia actually is legitimately in a weak position, and even the sustainability of the continued rule of the government is in doubt. And I say this because clearly, and this is beyond debate, I would think, Russia is mired in what has become a long-term military quagmire in Ukraine, and that diminishes and depletes any country. It diminished the U.S. when it expended a massive amount of blood and resources on misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so we would expect that kind of draining commitment to have an eventually deleterious effect on whichever state is conducting it.
Okay, Katerina, Kotrikadze, your thoughts?
Well, we know that Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner group was quite important and strong on the ground in Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was his field, if I can say something like that. So after they are out of Ukraine, because as we understand, they're planning to move to Belarus, is going to be a very good opportunity. It would be an open window for Ukrainian armed forces to regain control over their own territories on eastern Ukraine, which is an important step forward.
Okay, and let's feel free to interact. Now, I do want us to circle back to the conversation we had before the break about whether Putin solidified his position or not. If there is an underlying understanding, so to speak, that Putin will be part of this or that solution. After the rebellion, again, referring to the point in time that Michael Tracey noted, before and after the rebellion. After the rebellion, isn't Putin stronger, Yaki, Dayan?
It's like a losing share. He lost so much in the stock exchange that now he cannot bail out from this war in Ukraine. He lost his reputation, he lost his international status, he lost economically, and now he's so much invested in the Ukraine, so he's not going to pull out from the Ukraine.
Hey, Katerina, I can see that you're in disagreement.
Yeah.
No. I was just saying that I was thinking that Vladimir Putin, as an ex-KGB agent, his biography, right? He became a president in 2000. So during this 23 years, he was obsessed with internal coup, with an idea of internal problems that he can get from the representatives of the lead. And he was truly disappointed by Dmitry Medvedev, a person who became a president just for 4 years. In between to save the throne for Vladimir Putin. So he was very disappointed with Medvedev because the level of liberal vibe was very high during Medvedev's presidency. And then Putin came back with the terrible repressions that were going on and still going on in Russian Federation. What I think is that he is now in a panical position. He's panicking because he saw that the problem comes from a person that he has created with his own hands, that the problem can come from a very surprising side. So right now I'm expecting even worse repressions in Russia, even more terrible situation with human rights and freedom of speech, arrests, and this is something that is inevitable.
And yet maybe amidst the chaos, all one can ask for is to better your positioning from one day to another. And this is, if I understand correctly, Michael Tracey's claim is the case for Putin. But let's move on to the Ukrainian side of the...
Can I address something
Please, Michael,
about that really quickly? Yeah. So we can't say with any certainty, it's an unanswerable question as to how exactly this will either increase or decrease the power of Putin. Like, it's an unanswerable question, so we can speculate. It's interesting, but we don't know for certain. I wanted to throw out something that is for certain and see if anybody has a reaction to it, because I don't know if you see these sorts of people online, but I notice that there's an element of sort of online readers out there or viewers who are instantaneously inclined to declare some kind of conspiracy at every possible opportunity. Now, conspiracies do exist, but they'll kind of engage in lazy knee-jerk thinking and just assume, for example, that this armed rebellion or mutiny, as Putin called it over the weekend in Russia, was just the handiwork of the U.S. or the CIA or Western intelligence
Israel
services.
was blamed as well, by the way.
Exactly. Sure, but I wanted to throw out, hold on, let me finish. 20 seconds. But I wanted to point out that on May 15th, 2023, so last month, the Washington Post published an article headlined, Wagner chief offered to give Russian troop locations to Ukraine, leak says. And this is a leak from one of the classified Pentagon documents that was released over Discord in April, which at least allegedly said that Prigozhin had personally offered to become a secret collaborator with Ukraine military intelligence. We know that they're not that far removed from U.S. intelligence in that event. So it's important, I think, to at least retain some humility and an open mind as to what we don't know about the full scope of what transpired.
Forget the conspiracy. I think that the U.S. has a big debt to Vladimir Putin because it has revived NATO. NATO was a dying mechanism thanks to Trump and the Europeans, and it has revived NATO. I mean, not only in armed forces, but also in terms of money. And for the U.S., one couldn't claim, if you want to play the conspiracy theories, that this is a very convenient situation for the United States because Putin is weaker, NATO is stronger, Europe is becoming more and more American-oriented in terms of ammunition, buying U.S. arms. So the situation is extremely excellent for them. So they don't need Prigozhin. They have Putin.
But
that's more than enough for the U.S.
I think it's a I'm not exactly sure how you're using the term conspiracy here, but I read you an article from the Washington Post about a government document. That's not right. I said I was not sure the context in which you were using it exactly.
Oh, okay.
But you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to look at this evidence as proffered by the Washington Post that there has been.
They don't need that.
Collaboration between Prigozhin and the Ukraine military intelligence, and then the U.S. security state agencies are very intimately involved in that, and they're proud of it, and they want a lot of appropriations to fund it. So there's nothing hidden here. And, take a look at what Chris Christie said. He's the Republican presidential candidate. He said on Sunday on one of the national politics TV shows in the U.S. that the U.S. should take pride in Putin being destabilized in Russia because it's the fruits of what Christie says is our successful policy in Ukraine to weaken Russia. Lloyd Austin, Kamala Harris, Jake Sullivan, top U.S. administration officials have all said openly that the purpose of U.S. policy is to weaken Russia such that you can have a destabilizing event like this and potentially even
Okay. Well, when reality becomes less reasonable, conspiracy theories become more reasonable, right? Everything in the mix here. Michael, Tracey, Katerina, Kotrikadze, and Yaki, Dayan, thank you so very much for this.